all I wanted to do today was take this car for one last ride before they heavily salted the roads. You might be asking why the hood is up. Well, that's because it decided to give me issues. So I'm going to fire this thing off real quick, show you what it's doing, and see if we can fix this. So although it's actually running a little bit better than it was earlier, we still have a bunch of codes on the DIC. Alternator is not charging, and when I went to drive it before, I was breaking up really badly, had terrible throttle response. So I don't want to just jump in and start throwing parts at this thing. If you guys own one of these cars or have worked on them before, you know that they're very sensitive to any electrical issues. And I'm hoping, and I think that that may be the case with this car. This thing has sat for a while. Unfortunately, I have neglected it. It sat for about 1.5 years, 2 years while I've been working on the 56. So about time we do some preventative maintenance, check a couple things over, and see if we can get this thing running the way it's supposed to. So I'm going to grab some tools, and I'll show you what we're going to do. So really quick, this is future me, and I realized that the camera either did not record or I forgot to hit record when we did the test to see whether or not this alternator was properly grounded. And the way I did that is just taking my multimeter and checked resistance from the case of the alternator to the negative battery cable. We had 0 ohms of resistance, so I knew the ground was good. In addition to that, after we removed the alternator here, I did actually take it to a local auto parts store and had them test the alternator and basically eliminate anything else in the voltage system on the car itself. So at this point, or in a couple minutes here, you'll see, we did find out that the alternator was in fact bad. So realized that that wasn't in the video and just wanted to add it in here. Because that test we did for the ground from the alternator case to the negative battery cable came back good, we are going to pull the alternator out, and I'm going to bring it to the store to get tested. And the only reason I do that, rather than trust the multimeter on the back stud, is because I don't know if there's anything else in this car as far as grounds or anything like that that might be playing a part in this not charging. So it's really just one more thing, or one more fail-safe to check before I go ahead and replace this alternator or rebuild it. So yank this out real quick, bring this to the store and see what we get. I did find a company online that sells a rebuild kit for the alternator, so we might try that as well, just because I really don't feel like spending $500 on an alternator. Now, I do realize that there are cheaper alternatives for replacement alternators for these cars. I don't necessarily trust them, although I've never had a bad experience with them, but I have had them with other sensors. So this was the one I was going to go with, but we ended up going a different way. And I'm sure you guys can sympathize with that, because who would want to? Alternator is very easy to get out of these cars. You have the plug, 13 millimeter bolt holding the positive cable onto the back, and then 2 15 millimeter bolts holding it. Sometimes you might have to pry it out of this bracket, but even if you do, it's still pretty straightforward. Oh yeah, that's stuck. All right, so we have our alternator off the car, have it on the bench in the garage, and we're going to take this thing apart and see if we can find the smoking gun as to what's making this thing not charge. I suspect it's either the voltage regulator or the diodes in the rectifier, but we'll take it all apart and we'll see what we can find. I'm going to take the nut off there. And then you're going to have supposed to be 3 8 millimeter nuts holding this plastic cover on the back. We only have 2, so it's made it a little bit easier for us. But we'll go ahead, we'll back those out first. Try and keep all the hardware in one spot. This way I'm not scrambling for it when we go to put this back together. All right, so with those 3, or in our case 2, removed, we can go ahead and remove this plastic cover like so. All right, and then underneath here, we have our voltage regulator, and this is your diode rectifier board there. So you have 2 more nuts on the voltage regulator here. I'll take those off real quick. All right, and then you have 2 more small Phillips head screws that also hold the regulator on. So remove those. Okay, now with those out of the way, we can gently remove the voltage regulator like so. I don't know if you heard those snaps as I was removing it, but underneath this plastic cover here, once you pry this up, there are 2 tabs that actually rotate on the shaft of the alternator itself right here. Pull this cover off and show you. So cover just comes off like that. All right, and then these 2 tabs here are spring loaded. So we'll make sure that when we put those back in, or if you're doing this at home, you don't want to force that because you will end up hitting that shaft before it goes down. So you could just take a small pick, work that in, slide it down, get the second one. That'll go back in place like that. But for now, remove this. So other than this plastic guide here, which actually fits in the rectifier, I don't see anything visibly wrong with it, but I will probably end up ordering a new one just because we're going to have it apart and for peace of mind. But for now, put that off to the side. So with the regulator out of the way, next thing we're going to take off is the diode board here. So you have 3 wires coming from the alternator field. All right, those are going to go through the cover and get crimped into the 3 diodes over here. So I will split these terminals. All right, we'll move the wires out of the way, and then we can focus on taking the rectifier board out of there. All right, so we got those separated. If you are going to end up using this, just be careful trying to manipulate these little, it almost looks like a crimp connector. So just be careful removing those. You don't want to damage any of the tabs. But I got that out. Once that is out, all right, we're going to take a 13 millimeter. All right, now your charge wire from the battery itself will eventually go on this stud, but there is a steel barrel that goes all the way through. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. I'll just get. All right, so that is that small barrel that's going to go over that stud. Okay, so before we pull the diode board off, I'm going to test it while it's still attached to the alternator because we're going to use the case as a ground to test. Now, if you have a multimeter, this is probably the best way to test it. Some of these anyway have a diode test mode. So that symbol looks like, well, a diode if you're familiar with electrical schematics. If not, it looks like an arrow pointing to the right and then a plus sign. So that one right there. So I have that set up. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my red lead and we're going to test the anode on our diode, or the positive side. So we're going to ground to the case here. All right, and then we're going to probe the positive side, or our anode. Now, when you do this, you should have about, I think it's 0.6 or 0.7 volts when you test it this way. When you reverse the leads, remember I said before that a diode is similar to like a one-way check valve. So this way, you should have, like I said, 0.6 or 0.7 volts. When you swap them and go the other way, it should be open loop, meaning that there's no continuity between the two. If you have any numbers that are severe, or you get the same reading, it means that your diodes have failed and it is time to replace this. So, like I said, I have a feeling that this is probably the case with this alternator, but we will test it just to make sure. So, positive side on the anode. I'm going to spin it out of the way so you guys can see the meter. Positive side on the anode. All right. Negative to the case. and we have 0.0, kind of going all over the place. Let's see if I can. 0.014 that way, which is not ideal. All right, but now if we swap it and go the other way, we should see open loop. And we do not. We have about the same reading there. So definitely a bad diode. Just out of curiosity, I will probe the other ones and see if we have the same issue. I believe these are separate. I'm not 100% sure. But if you do go to test this and you do find one that is bad, it is time to replace the unit. So just a quick way to test the diode board. So now with that done, and that we know that this rectifier with the diodes is no good, we'll remove that. All right, it's 4 8mm bolts. All right, and then you have to take the wires from the alternating field off. These are like kind of like crimp connectors, so I'm just gonna spread those open. I don't have to worry about being gentle with these because this is getting replaced, and those new tabs will come on the new diode board. So I'll get these off. We'll pull the rectifier, and then we can split the case and see if there's anything else inside that might need our attention. Before we go any further, let's split the case open on this. So one other thing I wanted to mention, before you take this apart, always a good idea to just mark the case so you know which way it has to be clocked. And that's just so we can go back together the same way. But before you take this thing off and start ripping it apart, just take note of where the stuff goes. It'll make it a lot easier when you go to put this back together. All right, so you might just have to gently pry between the case. Now, there is a plastic bushing in the center here, which appears to have a crack in it. So I'll make sure that I order a replacement one of those as well. But other than that, everything else looks pretty good. None of the windings look damaged or broken at all. Thinking maybe it's a good idea to get a bearing kit as well, even though this was not making any noise when it was in the car. While we have everything apart, it might just make sense to separate everything and kind of do a thorough once-over of this. Okay, next part. I want to try and remove the pulley so we can pull the front half of the case apart. Now, they do make a specific tool for GM alternators. I don't have it, so although I'm not very proud of it, we are going to see if I can do it the old-fashioned way by just using a pry bar in between the fan and the case itself, and then an impact to get the nut off, and hopefully we don't split the case in half. All right, so I used the press, and the bearing on the front of the alternator is actually behind that plate with the 4 Phillips head screws. So I put the case on the press, used a torque socket inside of the shaft, pressed that down. So we got the front bearing off. I actually ordered a bearing puller for the rear bearing because the one that I have is a little too small. So I should have that here hopefully tomorrow. We can swap that bearing out, and I think while I have this all apart, I might clean and probably paint the case just to dress it up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and order a new voltage regulator and a rectifier diode board as well. So hopefully within a day or two, we'll have all the parts necessary to put this thing back together. But real quick, I want to just see if I can pull this bearing retainer out of the front cover. One more thing we can clean up. All right, so got the old bearing out. I have a little, it's a 1-ton press back there, 17mm socket through the cover, and just nice and easy, it came right out. So we'll be able to replace both bearings. Like I said, hopefully tomorrow when I get that other bearing puller, we'll take the small one off, and then we can go ahead, clean, reassemble the case, and hopefully have our Corvette back up and running in a couple days. I got my small little bearing puller off of Amazon. We'll see if this works. I needed something obviously small enough to be able to get inside of the fins on the fan here, but big enough to actually pull the bearing off. So this thing was like 10 bucks. So it definitely does help to put the tool in the vise. Nice. And there you go. $10 well spent. Okay, so I pulled the alternator slip ring off of the shaft, and I thought that it would come out in one piece, but it turned to dust, and it took a lot of prying to get it out of there. Basically, what the slip ring or collector ring does is it will allow electric current to pass through the actual rotating assembly of the alternator itself. And you can also see these two little tabs on there, and then another one on the other side. That was actually soldered to the original slip ring. So this is the new slip ring assembly that came with the rebuild kit. See the two little tabs on there. So I'm going to try and melt the solder on there, and use one of those little sucker tools to pull the old solder out, and then we can go ahead, place our new slip ring on, and either crimp or solder these connections. So that is the next step for this, and see how that goes. So these are the two soldered connections that I pulled off the old slip ring. So with those out of the way, we can go ahead and press our new one onto the shaft, and then we'll make our new connections in these two tabs. Okay, got the new slip ring on. Trying to get the camera to focus, but crimped and soldered those two tabs on either side. From there, this plastic guard goes on top. It'll get kind of pressed down into the assembly. All right, and then this washer goes on top. All right, and then our bearing will get pressed onto that side of the shaft. All right, so our first bearing will go on the shaft like so. Then we'll press it the rest of the way down. Kind of align these blocks a little bit around the bearing. So we got our press adjusted. Now for the other bearing, we're going to have to press that into the case first. Then it has that kind of retainer on it with the 4 Phillips head screws. But before I do that, I want to clean and paint the case. So we'll take care of that, and then we can slide the other bearing in. So I scuffed the cover a little bit, and we're just going to church it up with a little of this flame-proof silver. Let it sit on the heater for a little bit, so a little bit warmer. But we'll spray bomb this, let it dry, and then I'll tape off the backside. We'll do that. And then, like I said, tomorrow I should have the voltage regulator, and this thing can go back together. Well, because it's so cold in here, paint ended up running like a felon, but looks a little bit better. I'm just going to press our bearing into the case. Okay, now we can put our retaining plate on the other side. That's just that plate with the 4 screws. All right, now with that in, we can press the rotor back into that front bearing. All right, so we have the field in, Now our 3 wires are going to come through these 3 slots right here. Now, of course, when I did this, I mentioned marking the case to make sure that it goes back in the same orientation, which is all well and good and would work if I didn't paint over the marks. It is a few days later, but our voltage regulator finally came in. So now we can button up the assembly of this alternator. So before the regulator goes in, we're going to put our rectifying diode board on. Now you want these 3 terminals basically to line up with these wires coming out of the windings, but they'll also line up with the studs themselves. So let's find where this one lines up, which I think it's going to be there. All right, I'm going to secure that to the case with the nuts that we took off earlier. Okay, we got those crimped on. Tossed a little solder on all 3 connections just for a little insurance. But with that put together, we can go ahead and install our voltage regulator. Okay, there's really only one way that this can go on, but these 2 tabs, all right, are going to go over these 2 studs here, and you'll see the regulator has like a plastic bushing that's going to go inside of that stud. And then these 2 little tabs here, all right, those small Phillips head screws we took out earlier, are going to go into the diode board right there. All right, this tab is just a retainer. When you pull that out, there are 2 armatures that make contact with the shaft in here. So throw the last 2 nuts on for that. So voltage regulator is on. Last piece, all right, this small cap goes over your voltage regulator and the shaft. I did get a new one, so toss that on as well. And that pretty much just fits over the 2 plastic clips, pressed on, and that is all. All right, pull these back on. I think we're ready to toss this back in the car. Charging. That's good news. And we saved ourselves a lot of money. Let's take a look under the hood. So all in on this repair, we're at 109 bucks. Both of these kits for the diode and the rebuild kit, I got off of a website called alternatorbrush.com. They shipped both items very quickly. Everything fit the right way. I was pretty happy with it. And I think that I definitely saved myself a couple of dollars, and it's feel good that I rebuilt it myself. So hopefully this will help you out. I will say, if you go to do this repair, just pay close attention to what year you are ordering parts for. Even though 97 to 2004 is all the C5, they did have a couple of variations within those years. So pay close attention to that. Also, automatic and manual cars had a couple of differences as well. The main one being on the automatic cars, I believe there's some sort of clutch on the pulley system. So if you're doing this and you do have an automatic, just pay attention to that. But that is going to do it for this one. Our Corvette is back together, charging properly, and we can move on to the next project on that car, which should be coming pretty soon. So thank you guys very much for watching. We'll see you very soon.